Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Dr. Allie McCreary. I am an assistant professor in the School of Kinesiology, Recreation, and Sport here at Western Kentucky University. And today I'm going to talk about, well, first, what is research data visualization? Why do we visualize our research data? And then I'll get into really the how. And I'm going to show a bunch of examples and hopefully at the end, spend a little bit of time kind of going through some different examples of how to actually create some data visualizations just using some really simple tools in PowerPoint. So I'm going to I'll try to exit out of presenter mode at the end. We'll see how that works. So first, what is data visualization? This might be kind of intuitive or logical. You might understand what this is right away, but it's just any graphical representation of your information or your data. So when we think of data visualization, what probably comes to mind is things like pie charts or bar graphs, right, or maps. And those are really typical elements of data visualization, but it actually goes far beyond that. And we'll talk about lots of different elements you can use. And there's two main goals with data visualization. So the goals are typically to explore or to explain your data and your research. So an exploratory visualization, right, is really for us, for the researcher, the research team, to help us understand our data and our project even better. So this is an example of a table, and it's a lot to make sense of, and that's why I put it up here. It's different national park service sites all over the country, and it's some model outcomes of looking at climate change at different parks and visitation to those national parks. And it's a lot to work through. And this is only the parks that start with A. So this is an alphabetized list that goes on for pages and pages. So here in this example, what I'm trying to show is that if we visualize that same data, right, if we take some of those numbers from those tables and we assign them a color and a size of a dot, right, it helps us to work through that really big table of data in a much more digestible, easier way. So this map, again, it's derived from that table of data, but each circle or square is representing a different National Park Service site. And then the color is indicating under different climate change scenarios, if visitors report that they'll go to that park more frequently, less frequently, or about the same. And so right away, we can look at this and start looking at what kind of trends or patterns exist, right? And these aren't perfect patterns, but more or less, we see the red and the orange dots, which indicate increases in visitation at the more northern locations or along kind of that Rocky Mountain corridor in the Western United States. And we see the yellow and green dots, the big blue dots, those are associated with lower visitation rates under climate change. Those are going to be mainly along, the southeast, the southern part of the United States. And so this can just help us as researchers, right, start to tell a story about what our data collection is really telling us. And again, this isn't a perfect story, but we might say, hey, climate change could be a win for northern parks, right? They might see more visitation because they have a longer shoulder season, fairer weather for a longer period of the year. But this can help us just identify some of those early themes in our data and start to ask additional questions. So exploring through visualizations and then also explaining. So this is an example of that same data set, pretty much the same map, but it's just been kind of refined, right? So that it's now a public communication piece. So we refined that color scale that we're using to show increases in park visitation or decreases. We've added a nice title, right? A couple other elements here. And so this is an example, right, that we can also use data visualizations to explain or to communicate the really important parts of our research. So why visualize data? We talked about this a little bit in just those two examples. It helps you spot those patterns or those trends. It could lead to further questions, and it's really effective, efficient way to communicate key results. So here we see on the right side, well, I'll talk about that first. We see two sets of bar graphs, right? And these are representing confidence in the COVID-19 vaccine, and they're separated by different racial or ethnic groups. And there's two sets because they went out and polled individuals in September, and then they had a similar poll in December. And again, like we talked about in those earlier examples, we can look at these and right away quickly see some major trends or some major themes, right? That confidence in the vaccine is higher in December overall than in September. So confidence is growing. We can also look at it by these different breakout groups, right? That, in September, there was more hesitancy maybe with Black Americans and more confidence with Hispanic and white Americans. But now in December, kind of all of these groups have about caught up to one another. So there's a big story to tell there. And we could read this article on the left, and this will tell us pretty much the same information. But if you are walking up to a poster at a research conference, right, or if you're looking at a slide, sitting in a room, watching a presentation, what's going to draw you in, right? Are you going to come up and read this whole paragraph about, confidence in vaccines? Or, is it going to be this graph with these bright colors, these bold text? Really tell which one is probably more efficient at getting attention, keeping attention, sustaining that attention for the length of your presentation. So hopefully by now I've sold you on what data visualization is, why we do it. And so really I'm going to spend the rest of our time here this afternoon talking about how we visualize data. And the first thing you'll want to ask yourself is what part of my research project do I want to sort of visualize? What parts do I want to make into graphic information? And the truth is you can take almost any component of your research project and make some sort of data visualization component. So whether it's background information, your study area, your methodological process, your hypotheses even, and then of course key results, which is what we usually see. So just some more examples, right, to get you thinking, to kind of get your brain churning on what some of this might look like. This is an example of some background information on the concept of place. So this is a geographical term that also has social constructs, and it was first defined in the 1970s, but this term kind of evolved over time. Still a lot of text here, right? Not perfect, but at least it draws the observer or the viewer in a little bit more than just bulleted points, that we see in a paragraph form, right? We're kind of giving it another dimension. We're showing, hey, across time, here's how this theoretical construct that I used in my research, here's how it evolved. This is another example that I used. Actually, a graduate student of mine recently developed this. We were looking at the impact of recreation closures due to COVID on recreation behaviors here in Bowling Green. And so she created this really nice graphic that showed when public and private recreation facilities closed and then when they reopened. So that's along the top of the bar, and then underneath when she was completing different research tasks along that same timeline. And then just as a sort of context or another dimension here, she included, right, these different COVID-19 prevalence rates. So, over time, cases also increase. So there's a lot to talk about here where you don't have to have all your text written out. You don't have to have all your speaking points kind of bulleted out, but you can have something nice like this and talk about, your project background and talk about even data collection and methodology a bit here as well. Study area is probably one of the most common data visualizations, right? If you've ever read a research article, it's likely that they had maybe something like this that defined the study area. And so this one's really common. This example here is lovely. It's beautiful. The blues and greens are really nice. And it tells a bit of a story, right? So the study area here is in northern Minnesota, which is dominated by public lands, state forest and national forest, and then state parks as well in those blue squares. But it's missing actually a few things that a really good map typically has. So I'm going to show you another example. This one, not as pretty. You don't have your blues and greens, but you have your north arrow. You have your mileage bar, so people kind of know ratio-wise, what we're looking at, what type of space, how big this area is. You have a few more labels here. And while the previous slide, right, while this might draw someone in, and so that might be a good use of color, this, if you are going to duplicate, if you're going to have handouts, or if this is something that's going to be printed and copied, you might want to use a black and white color scheme in some cases, just because, if this is copied into black and white, you won't be able to tell any difference between those shades of green and blue. Whereas here you kind of retain some of that characterization with dashed lines or thicker lines and things like that. Okay, so if you're wondering, well, how do I visualize things like a process, like methods? These are a couple of examples of how instead of, typing out your method section onto your poster or having bullet points on your slide, instead you can throw up a graphic like this that visually leads people through your process that you use to conduct your research. It can be something really simple like what we see on the right, that you use some random sampling and then convenience and snowball sampling afterwards, that you conducted some interviews and then did some post-interview follow-up, right? Just to remind yourself as a speaker to touch on each of these three main points of your methodology. Or it can be something a little bit more complex like what we see on the left. If you want your reader or your viewer to have a few more details, right, you might include some more of the intricacies of your methodological approach. Hypotheses or relationships can be kind of tough to visualize. This is one great example a colleague of mine developed where she was going to measure place meaning, so how people become attached to a physical place, and then also what their key cultural resource values were. And so she made this sort of web, I guess you could call this, to try to hypothesize or kind of guess at what sort of relationships exist between, say, having an individual identity to an area and maybe valuing things like the lighthouse. This was some research done out on Cape Lookout National Seashore, growing up near the sea, versus, people who rate strongly with family identity. Perhaps they're going to be most tied to things related to history and ancestry and family memories. So just an example here of how you can start to actually visualize and represent even things like relationships between different variables in your study. There's also really simple ways if you're using any sort of theory or theoretical approach to your research. You can let your audience know what that theory is. You don't have to give a long-winded explanation, but just putting up a simple little, words with arrows showing how the different constructs you measured are included in your study, how they relate to one another, can be really powerful in people both understanding the theory maybe a little bit more and also them remembering that later. And then key results, which is what most of us think about, right? When we think about visualizing research, most of us typically think about visualizing our results because that's the meat of our story. That's really what we want people to remember. That's, what we want people to know is what happened, so what? And so these are examples of just kind of basic bar charts, and it can be simple data about maybe tree height after a forest fire, or it can be, user type data, so the frequency of visits to these national parks. And I included this example on the right because I liked one thing about it, which was that they included, these average visits and the total number. But I also included it because it's missing something. I won't quiz anyone here that's present today, but right, we are missing our whole x-axis. We don't know, how many visits, are these hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands. So let these examples serve as, inspiration, but we'll talk about some do's and don'ts at the end, and having that x-axis, making sure that your axes are labeled when you're creating charts or graphs is really important. So this is quantitative data, right? Tree height, number of visitors, very quantifiable numeric data. That's, pretty typical for graphs and charts. But if your work is qualitative, if you're using text as data or even photos, images as data, it's also possible to visualize some of your findings there. This is an example of some key results from a series of interviews. And so what they did, instead of just, again, giving a really basic bulleted list of their key findings, they kind of created some boxes and showed relationships between these key findings by including arrows and some description right underneath the main bold text concepts. This is another example of some key themes that emerged from some interview data. So talking to children about some deviant behaviors at schools, right? And some of these key themes related to lying. They just put them in a bubble, right? So it kind of draws our eyes immediately to those main themes. And then some of the subtopics beneath those are then indicated through these sort of tree nodes there. So when you are deciding on which of these visualization techniques to choose or to use, you want to think about what your intent is. Are you just trying to describe something? So on the left here is an example of, do we just want to talk about all these different types of organic fertilizers that we used in our study? We can use kind of a nice little infographic maybe instead of just listing them out in text. Or do we really want to analyze or explain or show people the differences? And so that's your bar chart here on the right, that these different fertilizers had different effects on plant height, right? So first think about that. So what part of your project, and maybe hopefully all the parts of your project will have some visual component. And then are you trying to describe that part, or are you trying to really analyze and explain that part of your project? You also have to think about what type of data you have. So this example here in this slide is categorical data. So when people respond on the census, to many different items, but they respond to different categories of race and ethnicity. And so categorical data, right, doesn't mean one category is better than the other or greater than the other or equal to twice as much or half as much as the other, right? They're all kind of equal, but we can show things like proportions through pie charts. And this is in relation to something like continuous data. So continuous data might be a number anywhere from -10 to 100 or whatever your number scale is. Obviously, displaying or visualizing continuous data is going to look a little bit different. So here they've taken their continuous data and kind of chunked it into categories of 0 to 30, about 30 to 60, and 60 or more are in those blue shades. And then some of the negative numbers are in those orange shades. And so they've really given some dimension then to their continuous data. And then the third type of data that you might be working with is rank data, where you have individuals rank order different categories or items. So this is an example of study abroad locations or options for students, and their popularity or the participation in these different study abroad options over a 4-year period. And so you can see how categorical data, right, but kind of with a continuous element, because they've taken this data and looked at it over a time series. And so the final question here, is what you really need to ask yourself is what is going to be useful to your audience, and also what is necessary. You don't want to throw up data visualizations or graphs and charts just because it's easy or just because you can, right? You want to really think about what are the key elements you're trying to communicate and make those have an impactful visual element, and that will be most helpful. So some different types of data visualizations. We'll start with 1D or one-dimensional data, things like lists that typically are not visualized but can be given a visual component. So things like, if you interviewed people from different generations and had them describe themselves, you could visualize, right, through some iconography here, and just using some different colors, what those key results were from, asking baby boomers to describe themselves here as an example. Or if your research was on injuries from sport and recreation equipment, right, we can create a quick visual instead of just listing out what those, the top injuries are from basketball. We can actually kind of create bigger circles, those sports where more injuries occurred, give again a little icon, a different color. It really draws your viewer in or your reader in, and helps them to understand and make sense of that information in a more efficient way. 2D data is what we're more typically thinking of when we think about visualizations. Things like maps are kind of the key example here, where you have this spatial dimension. So that's one dimension, you have state lines and county lines. And then you also have the second dimension, which here the example is doctor pay, right? And so you're applying some sort of color grade to lower or higher than average pay, and then shading each part of your spatial dimension accordingly. And maps can be a really useful tool. It's not necessarily something you have to create, but maybe if you are doing research on, a plant or animal species, and you just want people to know what is the range or extent of that species, to have some background information, you can reuse a map that's been created by somebody else. Or if you want to give some context to your problem, maybe you're talking about wildfires and the urban interface and some research in California. So maybe you want to show them a land cover map so people have an idea of where those really heavily developed urban areas are and how they're in such close proximity, right, to those forested areas. And so you can use a map like this to show that really effectively. You don't even have to say much. People can look at this and see red next to green, and so they can know right away, why this problem exists. 3D data, so the last one here I'll talk in terms of dimension, are things like surface renderings, volume illustrations, models. You can see the example here. My recommendation is to really stay away from these unless, your specific research is maybe on some sort of like mechanical engineering or something where you want to show a model or a simulation you've developed. You typically want to avoid things that are just really cognitively complex. If somebody's going to have to take a lot of time and energy to make sense of the visualization, it might be better to just use words in that case. So unless your research is unique and that it, resulted in some sort of model or simulation, I would recommend avoiding these types. Okay. So moving away from sort of looking at visualizations through the scope of dimensions and just talking about some different types of charts and graphs. The first one I wanted to touch on was temporal data, or data that has a time component. We've looked at a couple of timelines already. This graph here is showing a time series, right? So you have a population of different types of plant species over time. So from 1990 to 2014, right? You're telling a really pretty effective story here with just a simple time series chart, right? That over time, heat-loving species are increasing while cold-loving and neutral species are decreasing, okay? You can tell, some key results in just a short amount of space. Scatter plots are also very effective, just two-dimensional visualizations. They can be showing different trends over time, or this one is showing health index over income, right? Again, you want to make sure that you are labeling your axes appropriately, that you're using a good, color differentiation or color contrast. So here they've put their normalized line in red against their blue dots. And then alluvial diagrams are one that is less common, but can be really effective if you are looking at different categories in different contexts. So here we're looking at ethnicity in several different workplace contexts. So ethnicity in just the general US workforce on the left side, and then over on the right side, ethnicity in Google employee composition. And so this allows you to make some different comparisons if you are measuring, the categories or categorical data across several contexts. Again, if you aren't working with quantitative data, if your results or your data are words, you might find things like charts and graphs maybe less useful, and you might tend more towards things like word clouds. So this is a really simple tool. You've probably seen these quite a bit. They're pretty popular. And I've linked to a free word cloud generator at the end. But you can take, if you have qualitative data, interview transcriptions or historic documents, or even website content that you've been analyzing, you can copy all of those words into a single document. And what happens is the most common words, right, are going to appear bigger in this word cloud. And so right away, you can start to tell a story to people. If this was a word cloud generated from maybe interviews you did with students about COVID and the pandemic, what pops up? Well, COVID and pandemic, of course, but what else? Government, family, health, student. So this can be a jumping off point then for you to have a conversation with somebody to engage them in your research in a really nice way. Another tool I wanted to bring up that's less common, but can be helpful if you're comparing to an average, is this idea of a waterfall chart. So the center line here is not at 0, but it's at an average rating. And then the bars above or below that are showing, right, means for, in this example, over, this 65-year period for rainfall. It was either above or below average every year, right? We never really have that very average rainfall. And they've added, you know, some more details to this waterfall chart by giving the bars different colors so that the viewer can see right away El Nino and La Nina years in comparison to normal years. And again, you can start asking questions, explaining, drawing some inferences just from a quick visual. Another one that is maybe less common is this idea of a tree map. This works well with both quantitative and qualitative data because we're really talking about proportions and dominance more so than, you know, continuous numbers comparing one to the other. So this is an example of just revenue of like grocery sales by department, right? And you can see right away what are the bigger sellers in each of these categories. This was another example I found that I thought, you know, it stuck out right away because you can look at US car sales in 2017 and right away you can tell, well, who are the more dominant sort of car companies, right? Ford, Toyota, Chevy. But then you can also kind of look at this on two scales. So comparing companies to companies, but also within a company, you know, you can look at Ford and say, oh, wow, about a quarter of their, you know, sales are all in this F series. And I'm not a car person, so I'm not sure what that means, but this can allow you to start making, right, a lot of inferences and start drawing some conclusions about your data in a nice graphic way. If your research has to do with anything that is hierarchical in structure, so here we have like trees, right? We have all tree species and then they've separated them into tropical, eastern and western and hardwoods and softwoods. If you are maybe studying like a subset of a larger class of items, things like tree charts, dendrograms, tree maps, they all kind of fall under this similar structure that allows you to show maybe, you know, if you're focusing on just these softwood evergreen species in the Western United States, you can kind of show how they fit in context with all other trees in the United States or the world. And then finally, the last example here that I'll go over is network data. So again, really useful if you are comparing organizations or individuals or looking at connections between different people or places. This allows you to sort of visualize some of those relationships that exist within networks. These are called matrix or node link type maps. But this example here, right, shows some data where maybe you've given all of your participants, you know, a non-identifying name. And then one of your interview questions was maybe about, you know, who do you go to? What colleague do you go to if you need help in the workplace? And a map like this can show you right away. Well, someone like Bill, right? He has 4 connections coming into him. So he has quite a bit of people that come to him for help versus someone like Kathy, right? 2 connections coming into her. So this can allow you to start looking at some of your data and explaining some of the relationship type data that might be derived from your project. All right, so a lot of examples. Hopefully, you know, you found something along the way that you think, hey, that might work or that could be cool. And again, these are just a jumping off point, you know, to inspire really. And then it's up to you to kind of get creative. Some general tips, one I mentioned, make sure if you're using a graph or chart that you have your X and Y axes, just make sure they make sense, that you're using correct units, and overall the concepts that you have along those axes are correct. Also, of course, think about color. All of these different visualizations either used color to their advantage, right? Or they maybe forewent any sort of color if it was something where, again, if you're going to print it out or copy it or, you know, have it passed around, maybe you avoid using color or make sure you have really good contrast in your color. It's also important to think about what color means, right? We know when we see red, that typically means like stop or negative or danger, right? There are certain sort of emotions or ideas that we connect with certain colors. Whereas if we see green, right, that usually means growth or increase or go. So think about too, when you're using these colors, how they can tell a story in themselves, right? If you pick the right color, you don't even have to say some of the things that that color might communicate for you. Okay, so this is where I might try to exit presenter mode. We'll see how it goes. But you know, if you're thinking now, okay, this is great, I'm sold, I'm going to do some data visualization, I'm going to replace all my words on my slide and poster, and I'm going to use some figures and graphics instead. but where do I start? A lot of this can just be generated right in PowerPoint, which is probably where you're making your slideshow or making your poster anyways. This is an example of just quickly putting in some lines and circles, right? And you get a timeline or some arrows and ovals, and you get, your social network, some of your node linked graphic representations. Or you want to do one of those tree maps, right? Just a series of triangles, or I'm sorry, rectangles. But these are just really simple to do. You just go to insert shape, and there's already, color schemes that PowerPoint has developed, so you can get some consistency in the colors you're using. And they make it really easy just to create these shapes, kind of play around with them. You can add text, the width and the depth of these different shapes. So a few examples there. Also in PowerPoint, they have something called Smart Art. So probably you're familiar with this, but if not, it is right under that Insert tab as well. So you can go to Insert Shape, or you can go to Insert and then Smart Art. It allows you to create all sorts of cool things, like these processy trees. I'm gonna try to see. So just insert, right, Smart Art, and you can see the whole list that comes up here. You can do cycles, right? So maybe you want to show something like that, or relationships. I think one of the most common data visualizations are these Venn diagrams, which show overlap in different concepts. And you'll see an arrow that will allow you to just come out and edit text. And then you can change colors pretty easily. So if you want them all a different color, or you don't want them to, you want them all the same color, but you're able to really easily create some pretty sophisticated looking visualizations, right, with just a click of the button. And then the third kind of element, also under that insert button, is just this idea of charts. And again, there are a number of sort of pre-formatted, right, your diagram or your tree map, your histogram, even the waterfall type of charts. All of those are kind of set up in your PowerPoint so that you can create those pretty easily. This is one example here. And I just wanted to kind of show you that you can come in and you can set your data up manually. So you can come in, or if you have all of your data in an Excel spreadsheet, it's really easy to just copy and paste that data over as well. And then you can edit things, like once you're in here. So this is just an example looking at sight word recognition by different age groups over a 4-month period. And maybe you're like, oh, if you kind of messed up how you entered your data, it allows you to even switch your columns and rows really easily. So it's pretty foolproof. You can add all sorts of things. You can add a chart title, you can take that away. You can add data labels or take those away. So all of these are just really great, easy tools. Don't feel like you're going to break anything. Just come in and start playing around. Maybe you start super simple, just with shapes and text boxes. Maybe you find what you need here under one of these standard templates, or maybe you get in and start using some of those charts as well. All right. The last few examples here, actually, I won't go to all these websites, but hopefully you'll be able, if you can't click them in the recording, I guess you won't be able to. They're all pretty simple web addresses. The word cloud generator I mentioned, that will create a word cloud for you. Tableau is a great website. If you're looking to make more advanced type of visualizations, that can be really helpful. I know there's a free version, but unless you're trying to make a larger time and possibly money investment, that one is a bit more sophisticated. And then Venngage is a great website for making more infographic style visualization. So less on the charts and graphs and more on choosing icons and color schemes and creating really nice infographics that way. So with that, I do have time for questions. So if anyone submitted questions, I'm happy to take them. Or you're also welcome to email me as well. So if you want to, you can put my contact information right with the recording, and I'm happy to take questions later. You're welcome. Yeah, there's just a ton of examples, and that was kind of the point, was just to throw a lot out there, because I know when we hear data visualization, sometimes we just think of the bar chart, right? We just think of something that's pretty basic, or that we've seen 100 times. And there's a lot of options, and things that I didn't even show, maybe in your unique situation, you know your data best, you know your project best. So just try to figure out how you can, right, some sort of visual component.
I have a question. Um, would you recommend using a photograph of, like I'm doing a research on Study Away, would a photograph be a good thing to use to express like an emotion, or how like transformational learning or social justice or things like that? Do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I think photos can be very powerful. And if you're trying to demonstrate, just like you were saying, some of those key emotional responses that students might have to Study Away experiences, I think, showing a couple of those photos and talking about them, people are typically really engaged when they see photos. They want to keep looking and listening. So I think that draws your viewer in. Yeah, I think that would be excellent.
I have a question for Ms. Thompson. Is it Dr. Thompson?
No, it's you can call me Leah or Miss Thompson or Professor Thompson.
Okay, this is not related to Dr. McCreary's presentation. It was related to a question that we had last week about the presentation. If we could do it on when we go live or with our recording, could we use the PowerPoint versus having to navigate around a poster? You said you were gonna?
I did ask, and I'll double check my email, but I did send a response about that. And they do want posters created within the same PowerPoint slide.
Okay. Okay.
Well, thank you all for attending, and yeah, this is the fun part, I think, of the research process, where you really get to dig through and tell a story and pull out what's most important and share that with others. So I wish you all the best of luck, and yeah, I'm sure it'll be great. Look forward to seeing some awesome presentations.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCreary. That was super helpful. I'm so glad we record these. Just very well done.
Well, thank you for coordinating.
Sure.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.